November 22nd, 1963, 12:30 in the afternoon. Dallas, Texas. 3 shots echo through Dealey Plaza. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy slumps forward in his motorcade. The world holds its breath. At exactly 12:48, doctors at Parkland Memorial Hospital make a decision they never wanted to make. They pronounce the 35th President of the United States dead. In that exact moment, 6,000 miles away, in a hospital in Munich, Germany, a woman screams. Not in grief, in labor. At 12:48 Dallas time, which was 7:48 in the evening in Munich, a baby boy takes his first breath. His parents name him Johan Schuler, a child born at the precise moment a president died. In 1971, a small Alabama newspaper called the Gadsden Times published a story that would send shockwaves through the world of paranormal research. The headline read, "Has JFK been reincarnated?" The story had originally appeared in Midnight, a tabloid known for sensational stories. But what made this particular story different was the involvement of a real parapsychologist, a man who had spent decades investigating claims of past life memories, a man who traveled to Munich to see the boy for himself. What he found there would become one of the most debated cases in reincarnation research, a case that has never been formally verified by university researchers, a case that exists in newspaper clippings and second-hand accounts, a case that, despite its uncertain origins, contains details so specific, so impossible to explain, that it continues to fascinate researchers to this day. This is the story of Johan Schuler, the boy who remembered being John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Welcome to Circle of Lifetimes. The first 3 years of Johan Schuler's life were completely ordinary. He was a happy baby, born to Norbert and Ingrid Schuler, a middle-class German family living in Munich. His father worked as an engineer. His mother stayed home to raise Johann and later his younger siblings. There was nothing unusual about the Schuler household. They were not interested in American politics. They did not follow news about the Kennedys. They had no books about American presidents in their home. In fact, Norbert Schuler would later tell investigators that he had only a vague awareness of who John Kennedy even was. To him, Kennedy was simply the American president who had been killed. Nothing more. The Schulers were focused on their own lives, their own country, their own concerns. America and its fallen president were a world away. But in 1966, when Johann was 3 years old, something changed. Something that would shatter the ordinary peace of the Schuler household forever. The Schulers had just welcomed a new baby into the family. A little boy they named Eric. Ingrid Schuler carried baby Eric home from the hospital, excited to introduce him to his big brother Johann. She walked through the front door, baby in her arms, and called out to her eldest son. Johann came running. He looked at the baby, and then he said something that stopped his mother cold. "John, John." Ingrid blinked. "What did you say?" "John, John," Johann repeated, pointing at the baby. "His name is John, John." "No, sweetheart," Ingrid said gently. "This is your brother, Eric." "Can you say Eric?" Johann shook his head stubbornly. "John, John." Now, to understand why this moment was so strange, you need to know something. John John was the nickname of John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., the president's young son, the little boy who had famously saluted his father's coffin at the funeral. A nickname that was used by the Kennedy family. A nickname that a 3-year-old German boy, in 1966, Munich, should never have known. Ingrid dismissed it as confusion. Perhaps he had heard a similar name somewhere. Perhaps it was just baby talk. She didn't think about it again. Until a few weeks later. And what happened next would change everything. Johan had discovered a magazine on the coffee table. Ingrid watched as her son flipped through the pages with unusual concentration. He was only 3 years old, but he studied each page as if searching for something specific. Suddenly, he stopped. He stared at one page for a long moment. Then he tore it out of the magazine and brought it to his mother. "Jackie," he said simply. Ingrid looked at the page. It was a photograph of Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of President John Kennedy. A woman Johan had never seen before. A woman from a country he knew nothing about. A woman whose name no one in the Schuler household had ever spoken. "Johan," Ingrid said carefully, "how do you know this lady's name?" Johan looked at his mother with confusion, as if the question made no sense, as if everyone should know who Jackie was. He didn't answer. He just took the picture back and walked away, clutching it to his chest. That night, Ingrid told her husband what had happened. Norbert Schuler was a practical man, an engineer. He dealt in facts and measurements and things that could be proven. He told his wife she was overreacting. Children say strange things, he reasoned. He probably heard the name on television or from a neighbor. It means nothing. Ingrid wanted to believe him, but over the following months, the coincidences kept piling up, one after another, each more inexplicable than the last. Johan began asking for American magazines. Specifically, he wanted magazines with pictures of pretty Jackie. When Ingrid asked who Jackie was, Johan would look at her with that same confused expression. "You know," he would say. "Jackie. My Jackie. My Jackie." A 3-year-old boy claiming ownership of a woman he had never met. A woman who lived on another continent. A woman who had been married to a president. One afternoon, Ingrid found Johan lying on the floor with a piece of paper and some crayons. "Why don't you draw our house?" she suggested. Johan nodded and began to draw. But what appeared on the paper was not their modest Munich home. Johan drew a long, low building with a distinctive dome on top. Columns lined the front. The proportions were surprisingly accurate for a 4-year-old. Ingrid stared at the drawing. "Johan, what is this?" "My house," Johan said matter-of-factly. "This is where I lived." "But, sweetie, our house doesn't look like this." Johan shook his head, frustrated that his mother didn't understand. "Not this house," he said. "My other house, the big white one." Ingrid felt a chill run down her spine. Her 4-year-old son had drawn a crude but recognizable image of the White House, a building he had never seen, in a country he had never visited. How do you explain that? How does a child draw a building from his imagination that happens to match one of the most famous buildings in the world? The skeptic would say, coincidence. The skeptic would say, he must have seen a picture somewhere. But the Schulers were adamant. They had no American magazines in their home before Johan started asking for them. They had no pictures of the White House. They had no reason to discuss American politics with a toddler. And yet, Johan knew. He knew about Jackie. He knew about John. He knew about the big White House with the dome. And he was about to know something else, something that would shake even his skeptical father. In 1968, the Schuler household received a shock that would further cement the strangeness of Johan's behavior. Senator Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of the slain president, was assassinated in Los Angeles. It was June 5, 1968. Robert Kennedy had just won the California Democratic primary. He was on his way to potentially becoming the next president of the United States. And then, in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, he was shot. He died the next day. Norbert and Ingrid were discussing the news at the dinner table. They mentioned that Robert Kennedy had been killed, the American senator, the brother of the president who died. Suddenly, 5-year-old Johan burst into tears. Violent, uncontrollable sobs. The kind of grief you would expect from someone who had lost a family member. Not from a child hearing about a foreign politician he had never met. Ingrid rushed to comfort him. "Johan, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" Between sobs, Johan choked out 2 words. "Bobby's dead." Norbert and Ingrid exchanged a look. They had said Robert Kennedy. They had not said Bobby. Bobby was the nickname used by Kennedy's family and close friends. A nickname a 5-year-old German boy should not have known. And yet, Johan knew. He knew, and he grieved, as if he had lost his own brother. That night, after the children were asleep, Norbert Schuler sat in his study for a long time. He was a man of science, a man of logic, but he could not logically explain what was happening with his son. The next morning, he made a decision. He would write to someone who studied these kinds of phenomena, someone who might have answers. He would write to Professor H.N. Banerjee. Professor Hemendra Nath Banerjee was not an ordinary researcher. He was a parapsychologist from the University of Rajasthan in India. He had spent over 2 decades investigating cases of children who claimed to remember previous lives. He had written books on the subject, including Americans Who Have Been Reincarnated. He had traveled the world documenting cases, and in 1970 he received a letter from Germany that immediately captured his attention. The letter was from Norbert Schuler. It detailed the strange behaviors and statements of his son Johan, the recognition of Jackie Kennedy, the drawing of the White House, the inexplicable grief over Bobby Kennedy's death, and something else, something Norbert had hesitated to mention. A birthmark. Johan had been born with a distinctive birthmark on the upper right side of his head, the exact location where President Kennedy had received his fatal wound. Professor Banerjee read the letter 3 times. Then he booked a flight to Munich. When Professor Banerjee arrived at the Schuler home in early 1971, Johan was 7 years old. The parapsychologist would spend 3 full days with the family. 3 days of interviews, 3 days of tests. 3 days that would produce some of the most remarkable testimony he had ever recorded. On the first day, Professor Banerjee simply observed Johan. He watched how the boy interacted with his family. He noted his mannerisms, his speech patterns, his interests. Several things stood out immediately. Johan had an unusual fascination with American history. He collected any magazine or newspaper clipping related to the United States that he could find. He had taught himself basic English from these materials, and he had an almost encyclopedic knowledge of American political figures from the 1960s. Knowledge that a 7-year-old German boy had no obvious way of acquiring. On the second day, Professor Banerjee began his formal interview with Johan. He asked the boy to tell him about his memories. Johan spoke freely. More freely, his parents noted, than he had ever spoken to them. "I remember being important," Johan told Professor Banerjee. "People cheered for me. Everywhere I went, there were crowds." Professor Banerjee nodded, taking careful notes. "Tell me about where you lived." "In a big white house," Johan said. "It had many rooms. There was a special room where I worked. An oval room. Now, the Oval Office was not common knowledge to most people in 1971. This was before the Internet, before 24-hour news channels, before presidential documentaries were available at the click of a button. The Oval Office was known to political insiders and historians. It was not known to 7-year-old German children. And yet, Johan knew. What else do you remember about this house? There was a woman, Johan continued. She worked near my office. Her name was Lincoln. Professor Banerjee kept his expression neutral, but inside, his heart was racing. Evelyn Lincoln had been President Kennedy's personal secretary. She worked in the office directly adjacent to the Oval Office. This was not information that appeared in magazines or newspapers. This was a detail known only to those who had worked closely with Kennedy. How could a 7-year-old German boy know the name of Kennedy's secretary? The skeptic would say he read it somewhere. But where? In 1971? Germany? In what publication available to a child? Professor Banerjee could find no explanation. "Tell me about your wife," Professor Banerjee prompted. "Jackie," Johan said, his face softening. "She was very beautiful. Very neat. Very neat." An unusual thing for a child to say about a woman. Not pretty, not nice, not kind, neat. "She always laid out her clothes the night before," Johan continued. "Even her gloves. She would put them at the foot of the bed before she went to sleep." Professor Banerjee made a note to verify this detail later. It was the kind of intimate, personal information that would be nearly impossible for a child to fabricate. The kind of detail that only someone who had lived with Jacqueline Kennedy would know. Later, Professor Banerjee tracked down former White House staff members. They confirmed this detail. Jackie Kennedy did indeed lay out her clothes the night before, including her gloves, at the foot of the bed. It was a personal habit that had never been reported in any magazine or newspaper. There was no way Johan could have known this, unless he had been there, unless he had watched her do it, unless he had been John Fitzgerald Kennedy. On the third day, Professor Banerjee pushed further. He wanted to test Johan's knowledge of events that had defined the Kennedy presidency. "Tell me about Cuba," he said. Johan's expression darkened. "Cuba was a mistake," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "We shouldn't have fought," Johan explained. "Castro would defeat himself. There didn't need to be fighting." Professor Banerjee felt the hairs on his neck stand up. Johan was referencing the Bay of Pigs invasion, a disastrous 1961 operation that Kennedy had later acknowledged as one of the biggest mistakes of his presidency. But Johan wasn't just stating facts. He was expressing an opinion that Kennedy himself had expressed in private conversations with advisors. The opinion that the invasion had been unnecessary, that Castro's regime would have eventually collapsed on its own. This was not public knowledge in 1971. This was insider information, the kind of thing that would only come out years later in declassified documents and memoirs. And yet, a 7-year-old German boy knew it, and expressed it with the conviction of someone who had lived it. Professor Banerjee asked his next question carefully. "Johan, do you remember going to Texas?" The boy's face changed. A shadow passed over his features. "The people there wanted to see me," Johan said slowly. "My friends wanted me to go." He paused. "I didn't want to go." "Why not?" Johan didn't answer. He simply raised his hand and touched the birthmark on the upper right side of his head. And in that gesture, Professor Banerjee saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. A boy touching the place where a president had died. A mark on his head where a bullet had struck. A wound that had ended one life, and perhaps begun another. Before we continue with Johan's story, I need to tell you something important. Johan Schuler is not the only child who has claimed to remember being a famous person. Throughout the history of reincarnation research, there have been several cases of children claiming memories of well-known historical figures. Most of these cases are impossible to verify. Most are likely fantasy or wish fulfillment, but a few have details that make researchers pause. In 1930, a young girl in Delhi, India, named Shanti Devi, began claiming she remembered a previous life as a woman named Lugdi Bai. She provided specific details about her former husband, her home in a town called Mathura, and the circumstances of her death. When investigators took her to Mathura, she recognized her former husband and in-laws. She knew details about the house that had changed since Lugdi Bai's death. She knew where money had been hidden that even the family had forgotten about. Mahatma Gandhi himself appointed a commission to investigate the case. They could find no evidence of fraud. In 2002, a boy in Louisiana named James Leininger began having nightmares about a plane crash. He claimed to remember being a World War II fighter pilot named James Houston. He knew the name of the aircraft carrier. He knew the name of a fellow pilot. He knew details about the plane that crashed. When his parents tracked down the records, they found that a pilot named James Houston had indeed died exactly as their son described. This case was investigated by researchers at the University of Virginia. It was featured on ABC News. It became one of the most well-documented cases of claimed past life memory in modern history. And there are others. Ryan Hammonds, who claimed to remember being a Hollywood extra named Marty Martin. Chanai Chumalai Wong, who claimed to remember being a teacher who was murdered. Each case has its skeptics. Each case has its believers. But each case adds to a growing body of evidence that something strange is happening. Something we don't fully understand. Something that challenges our assumptions about consciousness, memory, and identity. Johan Schuler's case fits into this larger pattern, and it has one detail that makes it unique: the birthmark. Professor Banerjee photographed the birthmark from multiple angles. He measured its exact position. He documented its shape and size. Later, he would compare these measurements to the autopsy reports of President Kennedy. The birthmark was located in almost the precise spot where the fatal bullet had struck. The wound that had killed a president, marked on the head of a boy born at the moment of his death. Now, birthmarks are common. About 1 in 3 babies is born with some kind of birthmark. The skeptic would say this is coincidence. But here is what makes it strange. Dr. Ian Stevenson, the founder of Reincarnation research at the University of Virginia, spent decades documenting cases where children had birthmarks that corresponded to wounds on the deceased person they claimed to have been. In his book, Where Reincarnation and Biology Intersect, Stevenson documented over 200 cases of birthmarks that matched fatal wounds. Children with birthmarks where bullets had entered. Children with birthmarks where knives had struck. Children with birthmarks that corresponded to surgical incisions on the person they claimed to have been. The statistical probability of this happening by chance is vanishingly small. And yet it happens. Again and again. In culture after culture. In country after country. Johan Schuler's birthmark fits this pattern exactly. A mark on the head where Kennedy was shot. On a boy born at the moment Kennedy died, who grew up to remember details of Kennedy's life that he could not have known. Coincidence? Perhaps. But if it is coincidence, it is a coincidence of staggering proportions. During his investigation, Professor Banerjee conducted a photo recognition test. He showed Johan a series of photographs. Some were of Kennedy's actual associates. Others were random faces meant to test if Johan would falsely claim recognition. The results were remarkable. Johan correctly identified several members of Kennedy's inner circle. He pointed to a photograph of Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's press secretary. "I knew this man," he said. "He talked to the newspapers for me." Pierre Salinger had indeed been Kennedy's press secretary. He had served as the main spokesperson for the administration. Talking to the newspapers was literally his job. Johan identified Kenny O'Donnell, Kennedy's appointment secretary. "He helped me know where to be," Johan explained. "He kept my schedule." Kenny O'Donnell had been Kennedy's appointment secretary. He had managed the president's schedule. He had decided who got to meet with Kennedy and when. But when shown photographs of people Kennedy had never met, Johan showed no recognition. He did not try to pretend. He did not guess. He simply said he didn't know them. This selective recognition was significant to Professor Banerjee. A child trying to fake past life memories would likely claim to recognize everyone. A child with genuine memories would only recognize those he had actually known. Johan's responses followed the second pattern. There was another detail that emerged during the investigation, a detail that Ingrid Schuler had almost forgotten to mention. When Johan was 4 years old, the family had taken a trip to the seashore. It was Johan's first time seeing the ocean. Most children are delighted by their first glimpse of the sea. They run toward the waves, they laugh at the foam, they are filled with joy and wonder. Johan's reaction was different. He stood at the water's edge and stared at the horizon. His mother asked him what he was thinking. Johan's response chilled her. "I used to have boats," he said quietly. "Many boats. A whole navy." Ingrid had no idea what to make of this statement, but Professor Banerjee did. President Kennedy had served in the United States Navy during World War II. He had commanded a patrol torpedo boat, PT-109. His naval service had been a defining chapter of his life. It had made him a war hero when his boat was struck by a Japanese destroyer and he saved his crew. It had launched his political career. And somehow, a 4-year-old German boy standing at the Baltic Sea knew about boats. Many boats. A whole navy. There was also the matter of Johan's personality. Professor Banerjee interviewed the boy's teachers and neighbors. A consistent picture emerged. Johan was unusually charismatic for a child his age. He had a natural ability to lead other children. When groups of children played together, Johan naturally took charge. Not through aggression or dominance, through charm, through persuasion, through an innate ability to make others want to follow him. He was confident in ways that seemed beyond his years. He spoke to adults as equals, not with disrespect, but with a self-assurance that seemed out of place in a child. He was also intensely curious about politics and current events. His teachers reported that he asked questions about government and leadership that were far beyond a normal 7-year-old's comprehension. "How are leaders chosen?" he once asked his teacher. "Why do some people get to decide things for everyone else? What makes a good leader? Why do some countries fight and others don't?" The teacher had no good answers. But Professor Banerjee saw something in these questions. He saw the mind of a man who had spent his life in politics, a man who had risen to the highest office in the land, a man who had thought deeply about power and leadership and responsibility, asking questions through the mouth of a child. John Fitzgerald Kennedy had been known for his charisma, for his ability to inspire, for his intellectual curiosity about politics and governance. These same traits appeared in Johan Schuler. Coincidence? Or something more? Perhaps the most haunting detail came near the end of Professor Banerjee's visit. He asked Johan if he remembered anything about the day he died. In his previous life, Johan became very quiet. He didn't want to answer at first. Professor Banerjee waited patiently. Finally, Johan spoke. "It was sunny," he said. "I was in a car. A big car with no roof. Jackie was next to me. She was wearing pink." He paused. There were so many people. They were all waving. I was waving back. Another pause. And then there was a loud noise. And my head hurt. And Jackie was screaming. Johan stopped. He touched the birthmark on his head. And then I was here, he said simply. I was a baby again. Professor Banerjee asked if he remembered anything between dying and being born. Johan thought for a moment. It was dark, he said, but not scary dark, peaceful dark. And then I heard crying. But it wasn't sad crying. It was baby crying. He looked at Professor Banerjee. It was me, he said. I was crying. I was being born. Professor Banerjee documented this testimony in his notes. It aligned with other cases he had investigated. Many children who reported past life memories described a similar transition, a moment of darkness, a sense of peace, and then the shock of rebirth, the crying of a newborn, their own crying, as they entered a new body, a new life, a new chance. The article in the Gadsden Times was published on July 4, 1971. Independence Day. A fitting date, perhaps, for a story about America's fallen president. The original story had appeared in Midnight, a tabloid newspaper. This is important to acknowledge. Midnight was not the New York Times. It was not a peer-reviewed journal. It was a sensationalist publication that ran stories about UFOs and celebrity scandals. This is the source of Johan Schuler's story. And yet, Professor Banerjee was a real researcher. He did travel to Munich. He did interview the family. He did document the case. The story spread quickly. Other newspapers picked it up. Magazines ran features. For a few weeks, Johan Schuler was the most talked about child in the world. And then the story disappeared. No major network followed up. No documentary was produced. No scientists from prestigious universities came to investigate. The world moved on to other stories. Vietnam, Watergate, the oil crisis. Johan Schuler faded into obscurity. A footnote in the strange history of reincarnation research. A mystery that was never solved. The skeptics, of course, had their explanations. The boy had seen television programs about Kennedy. He had absorbed information without realizing it. He was simply repeating things he had heard. His parents had unconsciously fed him details. The birthmark was coincidence. The timing of his birth was coincidence. Everything was coincidence. These are fair criticisms. In 1971, there was no way to completely isolate a child from information about Kennedy. Kennedy's assassination was one of the most covered events in history. Images of Jackie, of the motorcade, of the funeral were everywhere. It is possible that Johan absorbed these images without conscious memory of where he learned them. It is possible that his parents, despite their denials, had discussed Kennedy in front of him. It is possible that the whole thing was a combination of a child's imagination and leading questions from adults who wanted to believe. These explanations cannot be ruled out, but they also cannot explain everything. The detail about Evelyn Lincoln, the knowledge of Jackie Kennedy's personal habits, the political opinions about Cuba that matched Kennedy's private views, the selective recognition of photographs, the birthmark in the exact location of the fatal wound, the timing of his birth to the minute. Each of these could be explained away individually, but together they form a pattern that is harder to dismiss, a pattern that made Professor Banerjee conclude that this case warranted serious consideration. It is important to note that Johan Schuler's case was never formally investigated by the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. This is the gold standard for reincarnation research. Founded by Dr. Ian Stevenson in 1967, the division has documented over 2,500 cases of children who claim to remember previous lives. Their methodology is rigorous. They interview families extensively. They verify details independently. They look for alternative explanations. They publish their findings in peer-reviewed journals. Johan Schuler's case does not appear in their archives. This doesn't mean the case is false. It means it was never subjected to their level of scrutiny. It means we cannot say with certainty what really happened. It means the case remains in a gray area. Fascinating but unverified. Compelling but unconfirmed. A mystery that invites us to wonder without giving us definitive answers. But here is what the University of Virginia research does tell us. Children who claim past life memories are not rare. They appear in cultures around the world. In families with no prior interest in reincarnation. In children too young to have learned the information they claim to remember. And in many cases, the details they provide can be verified. Names of deceased individuals, addresses of homes they claim to have lived in, circumstances of deaths they claim to have experienced. The research is ongoing. The evidence is mounting. And the mystery deepens with every new case. Today, over 50 years later, the questions remain. What happened to Johan Schuler? Did his memories persist into adulthood? Does he still remember being Kennedy? Or did the memories fade, as they do for most children? We don't know. After 1971, Johan Schuler disappears from the historical record. There are no follow-up interviews, no updates on his life, no documentaries or book deals. Just silence. This is actually common in cases of children who report past life memories. Dr. Jim Tucker, who now leads reincarnation research at the University of Virginia, has documented that most children stop talking about their previous lives by the age of 6 or 7. The memories fade. The child becomes absorbed in their current life. The past becomes exactly that. The past. Perhaps this is what happened to Johan Schuler. Perhaps, as he grew older, the memories of being Kennedy faded. Perhaps he became simply Johann. A German man living a German life. Perhaps he forgot the big white house. Perhaps he forgot Jackie. Perhaps he forgot the crowds and the cheering and the terrible day in Dallas. Or perhaps not. Perhaps somewhere in Germany, there is a man in his early 60s who still remembers. A man who knows things he shouldn't know. A man who carries a mark on his head that tells a story no one believes. We may never know. What we do know is this. On November 22nd, 1963, two extraordinary events occurred simultaneously. In Dallas, a president died. In Munich, a boy was born. The timing was precise, too precise, some would say, to be coincidence. And in the years that followed, that boy would say things that defied explanation. He would know things he couldn't know. He would remember things he couldn't remember. He would carry a mark that shouldn't exist. Was Johan Schuler the reincarnation of John Fitzgerald Kennedy? Science cannot answer that question. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But the story exists. The newspaper articles exist. The testimony of Professor Banerjee exists. The birthmark exists. And somewhere, perhaps, Johan Schuler still exists, carrying memories of a life that ended before his began. The research into children's past life memories continues today. At the University of Virginia, scientists have documented over 2,500 cases. Children who speak languages they've never learned. Children who recognize people they've never met. Children who carry birthmarks that match wounds on deceased individuals. The evidence is mounting. The questions are multiplying, and the mystery remains. What happens when we die? Is consciousness bound to a single lifetime? Or does something continue? Something that remembers? Something that returns? Johan Schuler's story doesn't answer these questions, but it asks them in a way that is impossible to ignore. A boy born at the moment of death, a mind filled with impossible memories, a mark on his head where a bullet once struck. In the circle of lifetimes, every ending is a beginning, every death is a birth, and every mystery is an invitation to look deeper, to question what we think we know, to consider possibilities we once dismissed. Johan Schuler was 7 years old when he told Professor Banerjee about his memories. He is in his 60s now. If he is still alive, if he still remembers. Somewhere in this world, there may be a man who once led a nation, a man who once changed history, a man who died in Dallas and was born again in Munich, watching, remembering, waiting for someone to believe. This story first appeared in a 1971 newspaper. It has never been formally verified by university researchers, but the details remain. The mystery endures, and the question lingers. In Dallas, a president fell. In Munich, a child rose. And somewhere between death and birth, something incredible may have happened. Something we are only beginning to understand. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, keep believing that consciousness is more than we think it is. Because sometimes, the stories we cannot prove are the ones that matter most. The soul never forgets, even when the mind does. This has been Circle of Lifetimes. If you're new here, welcome. This is where we explore real cases of past life memories, real research, real evidence, real mysteries. Subscribe and join us in the circle. Because here, we believe that death is not the end. It's just the beginning of another journey. See you in the next one.